James Parker's life had become a daily battle between making ends meet and keeping hope alive for his young son. He lived with constant anxiety. Yet one fateful evening, everything changed in a single moment of compassion. On a stormy night, James stumbled upon a shivering little girl lost in the rain. Without hesitation, he offered help, oblivious to the extraordinary journey he was about to embark upon. Little did he know that this small act of kindness would alter his destiny forever. And when the child's mother finally arrived, her request was something no one could have predicted. She asked James to marry her. James Parker lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Glendale, Arizona, with his 8-year-old son Noah. The building was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, overshadowed by the bustle of the city. The paint on the walls was peeling and the plumbing was far from reliable, but it was all James could afford. Every morning, he woke up to the same cracked ceiling and the same lonely feeling in his chest. Being a single dad was never part of his plan. Yet life rarely respects our best-laid designs. He worked 2 jobs days at a local hardware store, Manny's Tools and Repairs, and evenings cleaning offices in a downtown high-rise. Despite pouring his heart into every shift, money remained tight. He often skipped meals so that Noah could have enough for lunch at Redwood Elementary. To James, all his sacrifices were worth it. Each time he saw his son's bright smile. However, the strain was beginning to wear him down physically and emotionally. 3 years ago, James's wife, Mara, had succumbed to a sudden illness. She had been the glue holding the small family together, and when she left this world, James found himself lost. With no siblings and his parents retired to a different state, there was little he could fall back on, except his own strength. So he soldiered on, determined to give Noah a better life than he had. The nights were the worst, though, because that's when old memories haunted him. Mara's laughter, her comforting touch, and the dreams they'd shared of traveling the world together. One balmy afternoon, James returned from Manny's Tools, his limbs aching and his spirit heavy. He opened a stack of mail to discover yet again overdue notices, rent utilities, and a credit card bill that he thought he'd paid off. Stress knotted in the pit of his stomach. He knew he couldn't take on a 3rd job without running himself ragged, but that desperation was beginning to tap on his shoulder like an unwelcome visitor. He glanced at the framed photo of Mara on the small kitchen counter next to the salt and pepper shakers. Her gentle smile seemed to whisper words of encouragement. "I'll find a way," James murmured, as if speaking directly to her. Then he heard Noah's laughter from the other room, and that sound gave him the spark he needed to keep going. That very night, after tucking Noah into bed, James went for his usual evening cleaning shift. He tried to push aside the worry over the bills. As he locked their apartment door, a gust of wind from an approaching storm whipped through the corridor, nearly blowing the door shut on him. Rain was predicted, but Glendale monsoons were sporadic at best, and James thought he might make it to the bus stop before the skies opened up. If not well, getting drenched was the least of his problems. He didn't know that this storm would usher in more than just rain. It would bring a test of character and a miracle that would change his life forever. By the time James stepped off the bus downtown, the storm clouds had gathered into an imposing mass overhead. A jagged flash of lightning illuminated the streets, followed by thunder that rattled the windows of the tall buildings. He hurried toward the lobby of the office tower where he was scheduled to clean every step, splashing in puddles. As if on cue, rain began to pour, drenching everything within seconds. The revolving doors to the building were locked after hours, and James had a pass key. Fumbling with his keys, he glanced around and noticed a small figure at the edge of the sidewalk. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. She wore a light jacket, hardly enough to shield her from the downpour. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she seemed utterly lost. James paused, heart hammering. "Are you okay?" he called out, inching toward her. The child didn't answer. She only shook her head, water dripping from her trembling frame. He glanced at the locked doors behind him. His shift would start soon, and he was always reminded by the building supervisor, Mr. Franklin, that being late was a serious infraction. But how could he walk away from a child alone in a thunderstorm? He approached slowly, kneeling in front of her, to appear less intimidating. "Hey there," he said gently. "My name's James. Are you lost? Where's your mom or dad?" Tears mingled with the rain on the little girl's cheeks. "I don't know," she stammered. "I can't find my mummy." James took off his worn windbreaker, the only shield from the rain he had, and wrapped it around her. "Let's get you out of the storm." "Okay." She nodded, shivering. The streetlights flickered, half of them dim, casting a haunted glow on the deserted sidewalk. James looked around, hoping to spot a frantic parent, but there was no one else in sight, just the roar of the rain and the glow of headlights from distant cars. Leading the girl to the building's entryway, he tapped his keycard on the security pad. The glass doors slid open with a click. Once inside, they were greeted by the austere silence of marble floors and a quiet security desk. No guard was present. The night shift typically made rounds on the upper floors. James set the little girl on a nearby bench. "I'm supposed to clean here," he said. "Would you mind telling me your name?" She hesitated for a moment before whispering, "Sophie." "Sophie." James repeated softly, offering her a reassuring smile. "We'll find your mum, Sophie. Don't worry." He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was dotted with water droplets, but it still powered on. James dialed 911 to report a lost child, but the line was busy, likely overwhelmed by calls due to weather-related emergencies. Frustration gnawed at him, but giving up wasn't an option. He helped Sophie out of her soggy jacket, gently drying her face with a paper towel from his cleaning supplies. "Everything will be okay," he whispered. "I promise." Little did James know that in choosing to help Sophie, he had already set in motion a chain of events that would transform not just her life, but also his and Noah's. James glanced at the enormous clock in the lobby, the minute hand ticking perilously close to the start of his shift. Mr. Franklin, the building supervisor, was notoriously strict. Yet James couldn't ignore Sophie, who now clung to his arm as though she were drowning, and he was the only piece of driftwood in sight. He had tried calling the non-emergency police line, but given the storm, the wait was interminable. The swirling wind outside hammered against the large glass facade, and each gust threatened to break the glass in. In the distance, a flash of lightning illuminated the downtown skyline, painting the scene in electric white. "Sophie," he said gently, "I need to let my supervisor know I'm here, or I might lose my job." As soon as he spoke, the words guilt twisted in his gut. The notion of leaving her even for a moment felt wrong. He took a deep breath and decided to do what he always did, rely on compassion rather than fear. He led her through the deserted corridors to the supervisor's office. All the while, the overhead lights flickered as the storm battered the power lines. Mr. Franklin was hunched over a console, glaring at the building's security monitors. The moment he saw James, he pointed an accusing finger at the clock on the wall. "You're late," he said, each syllable laced with disapproval. "I'm sorry," James began. I found this little girl outside in the storm. She's lost. I couldn't just Mr. Franklin cut him off with a dismissive snort. Why didn't you call the police? It's not your job to babysit, and you're here to clean, not harbor strays. Sophie's grip on James's arm tightened. Her large eyes flicked nervously between James and Mr. Franklin. James forced himself to remain calm. I tried calling, the line was busy. I'll try again, but I need to make sure she's safe. Look, Parker, Mr. Franklin said curtly, using James's last name like it was an insult. I don't pay you to be a hero. We've got high-profile clients on the top floors. If they see a lost kid wandering around, it'll reflect poorly on me. Understand? So handle it, and do it fast. James clenched his jaw. Anger sparked, but he suppressed it. He knew that if he lashed out, he could lose one of the only sources of income he had. Instead, he nodded and gently guided Sophie back out into the hallway. "Let's go to the break room, Sophie," he said softly, ignoring Mr. Franklin's glare. "We can wait there until I can get through to the police." In the break room, dim fluorescent lights hummed overhead. James rummaged through the vending machine, purchasing a bag of chips and a bottle of water for Sophie with the few dollars he had in his wallet. She looked at him with gratitude, her eyes still brimming with tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. As Sophie nibbled on the chips, James tried calling the police again. No luck. He texted a friend, Samantha Carter, who worked nights as a dispatcher at the Glendale Police Department, explaining the situation. He prayed she would see his message soon. When Sophie finished her snack, her tiny voice finally emerged from the bubble of fear. "Thank you, Mr. James," she whispered. "I just wanted to see the big buildings, but my mummy was busy. And I walked away. Then I couldn't find her." She paused, eyes welling with tears. "I'm so scared." Compassion filled James's chest. He sat next to her and gently patted her back. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe now. We'll find your mum." A sense of responsibility washed over him, as if fate had entrusted this little girl to him for a reason. He didn't know what that reason was yet, but he was determined to see it through. Between cleaning tasks, James made sure to check on Sophie every few minutes. Mr. Franklin begrudgingly allowed it, but only after he barked a string of reminders about staying focused on the job. James responded with a stiff nod and pressed on, determined to fulfill both duties, safeguarding Sophie and making enough money to keep a roof over his own son's head. An hour passed with no word from Samantha Carter, and the local police line remained jammed. Each time James's phone screen lit up, hope flared in his chest, only to fizzle when it was just a spam notification or a silent, disconnected call. Sophie's eyelids drooped with exhaustion, and her wet shoes squeaked on the tiles as she followed James from one floor to another. Eventually, pity and practicality had led James to a decision. He couldn't keep her in this echoing office building all night. Nor could he leave her alone. Sophia was trembling either from the cold of her damp clothes or the lingering fear. Checking the time approaching midnight, James realized he had to consider a different plan. He set down his mop and guided Sophie back to the break room. "Sophie, would you be okay if we went to my apartment after I finish my shift? We can try the police again from there, and maybe you can sleep for a bit. It's not a fancy place, but it's dry and safe." Her eyes widened, but she nodded. James smiled gently. "All right. It won't be much longer." But not much longer stretched into another 90 minutes. By the time James clocked out, the storm had only partially subsided. Waves of rain continued to lash the streets, though the thunder had moved further away. Holding Sophie's hand, James walked her to the nearest bus stop. The street was deserted, except for the occasional car that splashed water onto the sidewalk. Neon signs reflected in puddles, turning the night into a swirling canvas of color and distortion. Once they finally boarded the bus, Sophie leaned against James. Exhaustion overwhelming her. He felt a pang of guilt. This little girl should have been asleep in her own bed, not wandering the city. "We'll be home soon," he whispered, stroking her damp hair. The bus ride seemed eternal, each stop adding precious minutes before James could settle Sophie in his apartment. When they eventually arrived, James scooped the dozing girl into his arms. He carried her through the poorly lit corridor, past chipped paint and humming fluorescent lights, until he reached apartment 2B. Fishing his keys from his pocket, he opened the door as quietly as possible. Noah was asleep in his room, and James breathed a sigh of relief that his son hadn't woken in the storm. He set Sophie down on the battered couch and found an old blanket. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Where am I?" she asked groggily. "Someplace safe," James replied softly, draping the blanket over her. "Try to rest. I'll try calling the police again, and with any luck we'll find your mum." Sophie nodded, and within moments she was asleep once more. James grabbed his phone, stepping into the kitchen to avoid waking her. He tried the police line again. Still no answer. He texted Samantha a second time, hoping for a response. As he waited, he watched Sophie's peaceful face. A cocktail of worry protectiveness and an inexplicable sense of duty churned in his gut. He thought of Noah, asleep in the next room, and how fragile children truly were. He had promised his wife on her deathbed that he would raise Noah with kindness and compassion. Now he felt that same promise extend to Sophie, a child so helpless and alone. Little did James know that this night of shared shelter was about to set off a chain reaction more dramatic than anything he had experienced since Mara's passing. Sunlight crept through the thin curtains, casting long beams across the small living room. James woke to the muffled sound of the neighbor's TV. For a brief second, he forgot about everything that had happened the night before the storm, Sophie and the tension at work. Reality hit when he spotted the little girl curled up on the couch, the borrowed blanket draped over her. He quietly tiptoed to Noah's room. His son was still sleeping, breathing softly. James's heart clenched as he imagined Sophie's mother, likely frantic with worry. He needed to get in touch with the authorities, but he also needed to figure out how to handle his day, Noah work, and this unexpected responsibility. A slight rustling in the living room alerted James that Sophie was awake. She stood hair disheveled, looking around with a mix of curiosity and anxiety. James offered her a warm smile. "Morning, kiddo." She clutched the blanket around her shoulders and gave a small nod. "Where's my mummy?" The question hung in the air, a reminder of James's unfinished mission. "We'll find her," he assured her. "Let me call the police station again. Then we can try to figure out where you live, or if we can find any contact info for your mom." He had a small stash of cereal in the cupboard, enough for Noah and Sophie. Setting 2 bowls on the coffee table, he apologized to Sophie. "I'm sorry, it's not much. Things are a bit tight right now." She shook her head, grateful for any semblance of normalcy. As she ate, James tried the police line once more. This time the line connected, and after a few minutes of being placed on hold, an officer took his statement. He explained the situation, finding Sophie attempting to contact them during the storm and keeping her safe overnight. The officer promised to send someone for a wellness check and to help locate Sophie's mother. Just as he hung up, his phone buzzed with a message from Samantha Carter. James, sorry for the late response. It was chaos last night with the storm. I let the officers know about Sophie. They'll be in touch soon. Hang in there. Relief washed over him, but the day's immediate concerns remained. Noah stirred awake and shuffled out of his room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He paused, noticing Sophie. James introduced them, explaining in the simplest terms that Sophie had been lost and they were helping her find her mom. Noah, a sweet-natured boy, offered Sophie the remainder of his cereal. She smiled shyly, the tension between them melting away in the universal language of breakfast. As the two children bonded, James felt a pang in his chest. He remembered a time when he and Mara had talked about having more kids. They had yearned for a bustling household filled with laughter and love. But fate intervened, leaving James and Noah to navigate life alone. Now looking at Sophie, he couldn't help but wonder if some higher power had led her to his doorstep. While the children chatted, James took a moment to make calls. He had to let Manny's tools know he might be late or miss his shift entirely. Financially, this was a risk he couldn't afford. Yet how could he leave these children alone? He considered calling an old friend, Gary Wilson, who sometimes watched Noah in emergencies. Gary lived on the other side of town, but maybe, just maybe, he could help. James dialed, praying for a stroke of luck. An hour later, the police arrived, a young officer named Kent Ramirez and his partner, Officer Mildred Jacobs. They knocked softly on the apartment door, their expressions a mix of concern and relief. Sophie immediately hid behind James, clutching his pant leg with small, trembling hands. Officer Ramirez crouched down to Sophie's level. "Hi there," he said gently. "You must be Sophie. We've been looking for you. Do you know your mother's name?" Sophie peeked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hannah. Hannah Henderson." James felt a surge of relief. At least they now had a full name. Officer Jacobs took out a small notebook. "We have a Hannah Henderson who called in last night, frantically searching for her daughter. She reported Sophie missing near the downtown library during the storm." Sophie's eyes brimmed with tears at the mention of her mother's worry. Officer Ramirez offered a reassuring smile. "We'll take you to her right now, okay? She's been so worried about you." A tightness formed in James's chest. He was happy that Sophie would be reunited with her mother, yet he also felt a strange reluctance to let her go. Over the past 12 hours, he'd grown protective of her. Still, he knew that reuniting a mother and daughter was paramount. Before they left, Officer Jacobs turned to James. "I understand you took care of Sophie all night. We appreciate that. It shows a lot of compassion. But we'll need to ask you a few questions just for our report." He nodded, leading them into the tiny kitchen. James answered their questions truthfully: how he'd found Sophie alone in the storm, how he attempted to call the police multiple times, how he offered her shelter out of concern. They seemed satisfied with his answers. When they finished, Officer Ramirez gently guided Sophie toward the door. "Let's go see your mommy." Sophie paused, glancing back at James and Noah. She dashed over, wrapping her tiny arms around James's leg. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. James patted her head gently, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You stay safe, Sophie," he said. "Your mum is waiting." Noah stood beside them, looking momentarily confused and sad. He'd begun to enjoy Sophie's presence. "Will we see you again?" Noah asked, his voice quiet. Sophie shrugged, sadness and relief mingling on her face. "I don't know." When she finally stepped out, James watched from the doorway as the officers escorted her down the stairs. For a long moment he stood there, heart heavy, yet relieved that she would soon be back where she belonged. Closing the door, he turned to Noah. "We did the right thing, buddy," he said softly. "We got her home." But why then did it feel like a part of him had left with her? James shrugged off the sensation, reminding himself of his immediate troubles. He was late for work at Manny's Tools, and the rent was due soon. He grabbed his phone, texted his boss that he'd had an emergency and would be in as soon as possible. Deep down, James hoped that was the end of it, that Sophie would be safe, and that life could return to its usual rhythm. Little did he know this was only the beginning. 2 days passed in a whirl of stress. James managed to patch things up with Manny's Tools, but only barely. His boss, Mr. Carson, glared at him from behind the counter when James arrived late, muttering about how this wasn't the first time. James simply nodded, apologizing while mentally counting the hours he'd need to work to make up the difference in his paycheck. Meanwhile, James's phone remained silent about Sophie. He tried not to think about her too much. After all, she was likely safe now with her mother. He had done what he could. Still, the memory of her frightened eyes and the way she clung to him lingered, nudging the corners of his mind like a persistent shadow. When he got home that evening, he sorted through the mail. As usual, the stack of bills and final notices greeted him like unwelcome guests. With rent due in a week, he felt the walls of his financial predicament closing in. He swallowed his frustration, reminding himself that at least Noah was fed and healthy. That was all that mattered. Noah was on the couch attempting his math homework. James ruffled his son's hair as he walked by. "Doing okay, champ?" Noah nodded, but James could see the question in his eyes. He too was wondering what had happened to Sophie. Just as they were about to settle in for a simple dinner of leftover pasta, a hesitant knock came at the door. It was slow and uncertain, not the typical pounding from the landlord or the swift knock from a neighbor. James stood up, frowning. Visitors at this hour were rare. He peered through the peephole. Standing in the dim corridor was a tall woman with dark hair pulled into a messy ponytail, her face half hidden by the poor lighting. Next to her, a smaller figure clutched her hand. James's breath caught Sophie. Heart pounding, he opened the door. Sophie's face lit up the moment she saw him. "Mr. James!" she exclaimed, letting go of the woman's hand to rush forward. She stopped short suddenly, shy. "Hi, Sophie," he said softly, a grin spreading across his face despite the surprise. He turned to the woman, realizing she must be Hannah Henderson. She looked slightly disheveled, wearing jeans and a simple sweatshirt, but her eyes were filled with gratitude and a hint of desperation. "I'm Hannah," she said, extending her hand. "Hannah Henderson. You must be James Parker. Sophie has not stopped talking about you." James shook her hand, still reeling. "Oh yeah, that's me. Please come in." He stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. Noah peeked from the couch, recognizing Sophie instantly. He hopped off, offering a small wave. Sophie waved back, her expression brightening at the sight of Noah. The two children giggled shyly, picking up some unspoken conversation from their brief time together. James offered the small dining chair to Hannah, but she remained standing, wringing her hands. Her eyes flicked around the modest apartment as though searching for something. "I just wanted to thank you," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "You saved Sophie's life. She was alone and terrified in that storm, and you took care of her like she was your own." A wave of heat rushed to James's face. He scratched the back of his neck, unsure how to respond. "I just did what anyone would do," he said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. Many people might have ignored her, especially in a city as big and busy as Glendale. Hannah let out a shaky laugh. "You have no idea how grateful I am. And I was hoping I could repay you somehow." James started to protest he hadn't done it for a reward. Yet something in Hannah's tone suggested she had more on her mind than gratitude alone. He could see she was on the verge of tears, struggling to find the right words. And in that moment, James sensed that everything in his life was about to change. James motioned for Hannah and Sophie to have a seat on the couch. Sophie and Noah sat side by side, each wearing a timid grin as they exchanged shy glances. Hannah sank into the corner cushion, leaning forward as if she couldn't quite relax. James perched on a wooden chair across from them. "I'm really glad Sophie is all right," he said gently. "That's all the thanks I need." Hannah shook her head firmly. "No, it's not just about thanks. You see," she paused, seemingly unsure of how to continue. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I'm actually a real estate investor. After my divorce, I focused on expanding my properties in Glendale. I'm financially comfortable. More than comfortable, actually. And when I heard about how you helped my daughter, I wanted to find some way to give back." James's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected this. He glanced at the sparse furnishings of his apartment, the chipped paint, and the stack of overdue bills on the table. A small part of him felt relief at the thought of financial help, but the larger part bristled at the idea of charity. He was used to fighting his own battles, no matter how bruised and battered he became in the process. "I appreciate it," he began, carefully choosing his words. "But it's really not necessary. I'm just glad Sophie's safe." Hannah looked at him, her eyes firm. "Please hear me out. I know what it's like to struggle. After my divorce, I was left with almost nothing. But I turned it around. If you ever need a better place to stay, maybe I can help with housing or job opportunities." James's chest tightened. Accepting help felt like acknowledging failure in some deep, personal way. He forced a polite smile. "That's very generous, Hannah. But I'm okay. Really." A flicker of disappointment crossed her face. "All right, I understand." She dropped her gaze, and an uncomfortable silence followed. Sensing the tension, Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, can I go play with Noah's toys?" Hannah nodded absent-mindedly. Sophie beamed at Noah, and the two scurried off to his room, leaving the adults alone. Hannah took a shaky breath. "Look, James, I know we barely know each other, but your kindness has really struck me. It's rare to find someone who'd go to such lengths for a stranger's child. I don't want to overstep, but I also feel something else when I look at you." James's heart thumped at her candid words. He wasn't prepared for any of this, especially not the subtle intensity in her tone. Hannah continued. "I just keep thinking that maybe there's more to this than coincidence. I've watched Sophie bloom these last 2 days talking about you and how you made her feel safe. It's been a long time since I've been able to trust anyone with my daughter, let alone a man. But with you, it feels different." He shifted uncomfortably. "Hannah, I don't know what to say." She drew in a slow breath, steeling herself. "You could say yes," she said, her voice quivering yet determined. Or at least say you're open to exploring something more, even if it's just a friendship at first. James swallowed. The air felt electric, as though the storm from 2 nights ago had settled into his living room. He thought of Mara, of how lonely he had been these past 3 years, of how his responsibilities and financial pressures had overshadowed any dream of finding companionship again. But now here sat Hannah Henderson, mother of the little girl he'd rescued, offering not just gratitude, but an unexpected opening for connection. It felt dizzying, like stepping out onto a high wire without a safety net. He looked at her sincerity shining in her eyes and made a choice. "Maybe we can start with dinner," he said quietly. "See where things go." A soft smile bloomed across Hannah's face. "Dinner," she echoed, as if testing the word on her tongue. "I'd like that." Neither of them could have predicted how quickly that simple agreement would spiral into a whirlwind of emotions, complications and revelations, culminating in a startling, life-changing question. That weekend, James found himself in unfamiliar territory, seated in a small, cozy Italian restaurant with Hannah, Sophie, and Noah. The owners, an elderly couple named Enzo and Maria Romano, greeted them warmly, leading them to a corner booth that offered a private, intimate atmosphere. Red-checkered tablecloths, softly glowing candles, and the smell of fresh basil and marinara sauce filled the air. Sophie bounced in her seat, eyes sparkling with excitement at the novelty of going out for dinner. Noah, slightly more reserved, watched her antics with a small grin. James tried not to feel out of place, remembering that it had been years since he'd taken Noah to a proper restaurant. Usually their nights out involved the local fast food joint, where a cheap meal fit his tight budget. Hannah, dressed in a simple yet elegant blouse, sat across from James. Every so often he caught her staring at him with an intensity that he couldn't quite decipher. He shifted uneasy with the attention, but also drawn in by her presence. After ordering their meals, Hannah gently prodded James about his life, his work, his goals, his struggles. At first, he kept his answers terse. He wasn't used to sharing his financial woes or personal hardships. But the warmth in Hannah's eyes coaxed him out of his shell bit by bit, and soon he was relaying stories about Manny's Tools, the cleaning job downtown, and how he felt guilty never having enough time for Noah. Noah and Sophie were busy drawing on napkins with crayons provided by the restaurant, occasionally looking up to join the conversation. Sophie asked Noah about his favorite games, and Noah, usually shy, seemed delighted to share. James watched them bond, a strange pang echoing in his chest. Could this be the beginning of something akin to a family? "So you mentioned real estate investment?" James said to Hannah, half to change the subject from his own life, half out of genuine curiosity. "That's how you support yourself. And Sophie?" Hannah nodded. "After my divorce, I needed a way to rebuild. I started small, buying a run-down house, fixing it up, and selling it for a modest profit. Over the years, I got better at it, moved on to apartment complexes, and now I manage multiple properties across Glendale." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. "It's been lucrative, but not without its challenges. And it's lonely." James studied her face. He recognized the hollow loneliness that came from shouldering heavy burdens alone. He wore that same expression every time he glanced in the mirror. "I get it," he murmured, his voice soft. "Being a single parent, you do everything you can, but it feels like it's never enough." Their eyes met a moment of silent understanding passing between them. Before either could say more, Enzo returned with their meals, rich plates of spaghetti for the kids and chicken parmesan for the adults. As they dug in, the conversation turned lighter. Sophie told a story about her pet goldfish Marshmallow, who had learned to follow her finger across the glass. Noah insisted that was impossible, and the children began a playful debate. James caught Hannah smiling at him as he watched the kids. For the first time in a long while, a flicker of hope glowed within him. Maybe he wasn't doomed to struggle endlessly. Perhaps there was a chance for genuine happiness, a chance to share the load with someone who understood. Later, after they'd finished their meals, Hannah offered to cover the bill. James tried to protest, but she gently insisted. "Call it a thank you for the other night," she said. Rather than argue further, James acquiesced silently, vowing to repay her kindness in some other way. Walking back to the car, Hannah's sedan, which she'd driven them all in, Sophie and Noah chatted excitedly about the next time they might hang out. James felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of camaraderie that had been absent for too long, as he helped Noah into the back seat. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a casual evening. Something deeper was unfolding, threads of fate weaving their lives together. What he didn't know was how quickly those threads would tighten into an unbreakable bond, or how soon Hannah's past and his own would collide in a moment of reckoning that would lead her to ask the unthinkable. Over the weeks that followed, James and Hannah settled into an unexpected routine. When their work schedules allowed, they'd meet up at Hannah's comfortable suburban home for dinner, or she and Sophie would visit James's apartment. The kids became inseparable, finding joy in simple activities like coloring books, board games, or weekend trips to the local park. Their laughter was infectious, offering James a respite from the grind of his 2 jobs. Yet life's challenges refused to stay at bay for long. One afternoon, James received an ominous phone call from Manny's Tools. Mr. Carson's voice crackled through the receiver, heavy with regret. "I'm sorry, Parker, but we're downsizing. You're one of the newest hires, so I have to let you go." James felt the ground tilt beneath him. The hardware store job was his primary source of income, providing a steady, albeit small, paycheck. "But I've got a son," he protested, voice hollow. "I need this job." "There's nothing I can do," Mr. Carson replied bluntly. "I wish you luck." And then he hung up, leaving James with a dead line and a sinking heart. Hours later, as the weight of that reality sunk in, James found himself at the dinner table with Hannah and the kids. He debated whether or not to tell her. Part of him wanted to handle this alone to prove his self-reliance. But as he watched Noah and Sophie giggling over a joke, he realized that isolating himself would only fuel his stress and overshadow the newfound happiness they'd begun to share. Gathering his courage, he confided in Hannah. Her immediate response was concern, not pity. "I'm so sorry," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "I wish there was something I could do." James opened his mouth to reply, but the kids bounded up at that moment, clamoring for dessert. Hannah's gaze met his, and a silent understanding passed between them. They would finish this conversation later. That night, after the children had been tucked in, James and Hannah settled on her living room couch. The fireplace crackled softly, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. She turned to him, eyes full of empathy. "I can help," she said gently. "I know you hate the idea of charity, but this isn't charity. It's me caring about someone I care about deeply." The raw vulnerability in her expression made James's throat tighten. He thought of the rent looming, the stack of bills in his apartment, and his meager savings. A single father, newly unemployed with no clear path forward. He sighed heavily, pressing his palms together. "I just don't know if I can accept it." Then look at it as an opportunity, Hannah offered. I have multiple properties that need upkeep. You could help manage them, inspect them, coordinate repairs, and handle tenant issues. You'd earn a steady wage. It'd be a job, not a handout. James blinked. The idea was appealing, especially coming from Hannah. It would merge his existing skills with a more flexible schedule, potentially giving him more time with Noah. And it would also mean more time with Hannah, though that thought brought a flutter of both excitement and trepidation. He nodded slowly. I'd like that, he said, his voice hushed. Thank you. A tentative smile lit Hannah's features. We'll figure it out, she replied. The sense of relief that flooded James was immediate, though it was tinged with an unspoken fear. Would this new job blur the lines between professional and personal, entangling them in ways neither was prepared for? Only time would tell. But with each passing day, their bond grew stronger, so strong in fact, that it would soon embolden Hannah to make a proposition that would change both of their lives forever. Weeks turned into months. James proved to be a quick learner in the property management world, and under Hannah's guidance, he took on responsibilities that not only stabilized his income, but gave him newfound confidence. His days were now spent inspecting apartments, handling tenant complaints, and organizing minor repairs. He discovered a knack for problem-solving that he'd never truly tapped into before. Noah and Sophie thrived in this evolving environment. Their weekends were filled with picnics at the park, trips to the local children's museum, and cozy movie nights at either James's apartment or Hannah's house. Laughter permeated the air whenever they were together, weaving an atmosphere of unity that felt dangerously close to that of a real family. Despite this, James still carried the memory of Mara. He kept a picture of her in his wallet, a gentle reminder of a love once lost. Occasionally, guilt would gnaw at him for moving forward. Yet each time he saw Noah's happiness alongside Sophie, and each time Hannah's eyes sparkled when she looked at him, he felt Mara would have approved. She wouldn't have wanted him to spend a lifetime grieving. One crisp autumn evening, Hannah invited James over for dinner. The children were off at a sleepover at Sophie's cousin's house, leaving them with a rare moment of adult solitude. Hannah prepared a feast, rosemary chicken roasted vegetables, and a decadent chocolate cake for dessert. The aroma of herbs and spices filled the house, and James couldn't remember a time he'd felt more at peace. After clearing the dishes, they settled on Hannah's porch swing. The night sky stretched wide above them, a tapestry of stars. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the elm tree in the front yard. Hannah leaned her head on James's shoulder, and he wrapped an arm around her, marveling at the ease with which she fit against him. They swayed in comfortable silence for a while, accompanied by the chirping of crickets. Finally, Hannah stirred, turning toward him. Her gaze was steady, yet he could sense the undercurrent of nerves in her posture. I need to tell you something. She began, her voice soft yet resolute. Ever since Sophie got lost that night and you found her, my life has changed in ways I never imagined. James's heart thudded in his chest, but he didn't interrupt. Hannah took a shaky breath. You are kind, compassionate, and a wonderful father to Noah. Watching you with Sophie, seeing how our lives have merged, I realize I don't ever want to lose that. Or you. His throat constricted. He thought of how each day felt lighter, how he no longer dreaded the mornings, how hope had re-entered his life. Hannah was largely responsible for that transformation. She continued, her words trembling with both excitement and fear. James, will you marry me? For a moment time seemed to stand still. James stared at her, stunned. Traditional conventions usually had the man proposing, but life had never dealt them normal circumstances. Emotions flooded him, a swirl of love trepidation, and an undercurrent of joy so strong it almost hurt. He realized in that moment that he couldn't picture life without Hannah and Sophie. He glanced at the ring box she held out. Inside was a simple, elegant band. The ring glimmered under the porch light, but not half as brightly as Hannah's eyes. Tears blurred his vision as he thought of Mara, of how she'd want him to be happy again. He swallowed hard, nodding a smile breaking through the turmoil. "Yes," he choked out, voice shaking. "Yes, I'll marry you." A soft sob escaped Hannah, and she threw her arms around his neck. They clung to each other, hearts pounding, tears mingling with laughter. In that moment, all the trials they had faced, loss, loneliness, financial hardship, culminated in a single, luminous promise that together they could forge a future filled with love, security, and the unshakable bond of family. The days that followed felt like a dream. News of the engagement spread quickly through their small social circle. Samantha Carter, James's friend from the police department, squealed with excitement when she heard, immediately offering to help with any wedding planning. Even Mr. Gould, Franklin from the cleaning job downtown, upon hearing the news through the grapevine, offered a begrudging but sincere congratulations. Sophie and Noah took the announcement with childlike wonder. "Does this mean we'll be brother and sister?" Sophie asked, eyes wide with anticipation. Noah nodded eagerly, already imagining sleepovers and holidays shared under one roof. Their innocence and joy only strengthened James and Hannah's resolve to move forward, and so began the whirlwind of wedding preparations. Hannah, being the organized planner, quickly set to work booking a small banquet hall near her favorite orchard on the outskirts of Glendale. The orchard, with its rows of blossoming fruit trees, seemed the perfect symbol for new beginnings, something James found poetic and fitting, given how their lives had intertwined. Despite the flurry of decisions, choosing flowers, invitations, outfits, James couldn't stop smiling. He found himself waking each day with renewed energy. Whenever doubts arose, whispers of guilt about Mara, or fears that he was moving too fast, he reminded himself of the profound sense of belonging he felt with Hannah. He also recalled the conversation he'd once had with Mara in the hospital when she'd made him promise to keep living, to keep loving for Noah's sake. He realized now that promise extended to himself as well. Finally, the wedding day arrived. Noah and Sophie took on the roles of ring bearers, each proudly carrying a small satin pillow. Hannah's closest friends gathered, including her cousin, who had once hosted Sophie's sleepovers. A handful of James's co-workers from Manny's Tools came along with a few neighbors and even some tenants from the properties he managed. The ceremony was simple, held under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. Hannah wore a modest ivory gown, her dark hair braided and interwoven with tiny blossoms. James stood at the makeshift altar, wearing a tidy suit borrowed from Gary Wilson, an old friend who'd kindly stepped in as best man. Butterflies swarmed in his stomach, but the moment he saw Hannah walking toward him, Sophie at her side, all anxiety faded away. Vows were exchanged. They spoke of second chances of resilience born from heartbreak of two families blending into one. Tears flowed freely, not just from Hannah and James, but from many in attendance who witnessed the testament of hope overcoming despair. When James slid the ring onto Hannah's finger, he felt a surge of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. Here they stood, two weary souls carrying scars from the past, choosing to believe in love again. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and they sealed the moment with a kiss that tasted of fresh beginnings and endless possibilities. As they walked down the makeshift aisle to the applause of friends and family, James caught Noah's eye. His son beamed a grin that spoke of a boy who had lost a mother, but gained a new family. And in the swirl of petals and laughter, James caught Hannah's hand, pulling her close. Together they stepped into a future that was theirs to shape a future sparked by a selfless act of compassion on a stormy night, and bound by a love that promised to grow steadily, like fruit in an orchard blossoming under the warm Arizona sun. True kindness has the power to transform lives in ways we never see coming. James Parker was a struggling single dad who believed he had nothing left to give, but when he helped a lost little girl in a storm, his humble act opened a door to hope, love, and the promise of a new family. Hannah Henderson's gratitude turned into admiration and blossomed into a love that healed two wounded hearts. This story reminds us that miracles are often hidden in life's simplest acts of empathy. So if you found inspiration in James and Hannah's journey, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that love can emerge from the darkest storm, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories of compassion and second chances. Together we can celebrate the power of hope that thrives in us all.